All right, guys, so we're going to finish up our slides on Jackson, and let's just get right started by talking about Indian removal, which you'll have an opportunity to listen to a podcast that digs even deeper into this really, really complicated and problematic topic in American history. But anyway, Jackson's presidency marked a major shift in Native American policy and reinforced the idea that Jackson believed that the common man, so to speak, was really just the white rural population. There's an interesting distinction here between how previous presidents treated the indigenous population. In the Jeffersonian era, white politicians oftentimes would push for Native Americans to assimilate in white culture, but not actually call for their removal from their land. Because of this assimilation mentality, you saw the emergence of what white American political leaders dubbed the five civilized tribes of the American Southwest. The five of them were the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. And they were called civilized because they were assimilating into white American expectations. They established schools where they taught their children in English. They bought land. Oftentimes, they would also buy slaves. They created their own constitutions that were largely based off of a similar democratic Republican model as the United States. But despite all these efforts to sort of assimilate into the white political sphere, the War of 1812 changed a lot of this, and Jackson's role in particular and his emergence also starts to change this. So remember, Jackson emerged from the War of 1812 as a military hero, and then later, of course, used this military record to run for political office and eventually make his way into the White House. And so, in a lot of ways, Jackson saw himself as having a political mandate. He thought that any decision that he wanted to make should be ultimately done, regardless of any roadblocks that stood in his way. So, to him, one of his major goals was to make more land available to the common man that elected him. So, civilizing, regardless of the problematic nature of the term civilized, that was no longer on his agenda. He wanted to just remove Native Americans from their land so that the people who voted for him would have more land available to them. Um, so one of the first things that's done during Jackson's presidency is the Indian Removal Act. It's important also for us to realize that this isn't just Jackson, right? The Indian Removal Act was an act of Congress, but Jackson signed it into law. So it was passed in 1830, and it created a plan to relocate the approximately 60,000 members of those five tribes further west to land set aside that would become Indian reservations. And one of the reasons why there was this huge demand for land was because the Cotton Empire started to expand dramatically in the American South, and so land was in short supply. And Jackson's approach was no longer emphasizing assimilation. It was to villainize Native Americans as a group that was standing in his way. And so again, he broke away from that previous Jeffersonian tone of assimilation and started denouncing tribes as savage and bloodthirsty. And by the way, we will get much more into the expansion of the Cotton Empire. We'll start talking more about the causes of the Civil War soon, so a lot of these topics overlap. So don't worry, we will examine that much more closely. So Cherokee leaders, again, since they were, in a lot of ways governing themselves similarly to the way that the American government was structured, they wanted to use the American democratic process to try to fight this act. So they took it to the courts. And they sued the state of Georgia actually a few times. And there are actually a number of different decisions. Foner gets into a few of them, but there are two that are worth pointing out. So notice that the court actually changes its tone relatively quickly here. So the first major ruling, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, actually sided against the Cherokee Nation, saying that they were not actually protected under American law. They were not seen as American citizens. But then the next year, Worcester, I may be pronouncing that incorrectly, or Worcester, sorry, I'm from New England where we say Worcester, versus Georgia, actually reversed its previous stances, and it sided with the Cherokee Nation, and it argued that the Cherokee people were sovereign people, they were entitled to their own political identity, and that Georgia's seizure of their land was unconstitutional. So it seems like a victory in the courts, right? And the courts are arguably, establishing the supreme law of the land. Well, for Jackson, that didn't matter. He refused to accept the ruling. Allegedly, he said, Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. which sort of goes along with Jackson's general motive of just doing whatever he can to get his way, regardless of the constitutionality of it. So checks and balances really didn't apply when it came to Jackson. He wanted these Native Americans removed, so he didn't really care about a Supreme Court decision. He went ahead with the removal anyway. And so the way that removal happened was through essentially a military process. Federal soldiers started to forcibly remove over 18,000 Cherokee people from their land from 1838 to 1839. And that's an event that was subsequently referred to as the Trail of Tears. And at least 4,000 Cherokees alone died during that forced relocation, especially in the winter when they were marching oftentimes unstopped day and night. And they were subject to a lot of violence from the federal soldiers that were forcing them to march. Also, the Seminole people, they tried to resist this relocation as well. They were predominantly located in Florida. And there was actually a war during this time, the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842. And that led to the deaths of over 1,500 Seminoles. And then another 3,000 who survived were also forced to relocate west to these new reservations in Oklahoma. So this was all an extrajudicial removal of Native Americans. They went against the Supreme Court's decision. And this is something that Jackson's coalition, all these people, these new people given the right to vote between 1824 and 1828, they supported this. So there was actually little resistance from white Americans. We look back at it today as a travesty, as a genocide, but at the time, there was not very much pushback from the people that actually supported Jackson. It was actually generally regarded as popular. And so this sort of contributes to the general mentality of white Americans at the time that Native Americans were obsolete. They were standing in white people's quote unquote destiny of expanding west. We'll talk about manifest destiny pretty soon in our next unit. And this pattern continued violently as the U.S. continued to add more territories to its possession. So we will get much more to that very soon. So let's finish up by talking about the Bank War. Another really, really interesting expansion of presidential authority under Jackson. So you remember the first bank in the United States established by Hamilton. Now we have a second bank. It was very similar in role. It was a semi-private institution, so it had private investors, but ultimately was also a public institution because it helped stabilize the nation's currency and it also helped finance the nation's growing manufacturing and transportation industries. The Bank of the United States was far more powerful than any state or local bank, and that was one of the reasons why Jackson and his supporters opposed it. They felt that this bank, especially because it did have private wealthy investors, only served the interests of the moneyed elite. What it did do beyond that, though, was it helped the American economy grow, particularly the northern, more urban, manufacturing-based economy. But Jackson, again, was largely voted into office because of the rural population that voted him in. So he made this a political issue in 1832 when he was about to run for re-election. He vowed to quote-unquote kill the bank by vetoing a congressional charter or bill to re-charter the bank for 20 more years. And he thought that if he vetoed this, it would be widely supported by the Southern and Westerners, people that did not have money invested in this bank, and people who weren't as interested in the growth of manufacturing. They were interested in the growth of rural America. So Jackson's opponents, the Whigs, criticized Jackson for abusing his power. The previous video I talked about how Jackson used the veto more often than any previous president in U.S. history. But again, his supporters hailed Jackson's efforts. They didn't care that Congress passed this charter. They were much more supportive of Jackson's veto, right, and his supposed efforts to fight for the common man. So he easily won election in 1832, re-election that is. And to him, he thought that his use of the veto was valid because he argued that he supported the people more than Congress did. So despite Jackson's veto, actually, the charter still had a few more years left. The bank was not due to expire until 1836, so Jackson not only had to veto the recharter, but he had to do a little bit more than that to kill this bank. So then, after he was reelected, he decided to remove all the federal deposits from the bank and place them in local banks. And they were called pet banks because most of the time these banks were run and headed by people that had a favorable relationship with Jackson. So think pet bank like teacher's pet, right? They had a special relationship with the president. And so that's why he put these federal deposits in those banks. Again, Jackson did this without congressional approval. Again, he made a similar argument to his veto. He said he could do this because he represented the people, and it didn't matter what Congress said. Congress was slightly more removed from the people at that time. Senators were elected indirectly. So Jackson just said, I am doing this. I am president. I have the authority to do this. So he not only had to do it by going away from Congress, he actually had to rearrange members of his cabinet. His Secretary of the Treasury at the time didn't want to do this. He did not want to redeposit these federal funds. So Jackson had to appoint not one, but another new Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Roger B. Taney. And he finally agreed to relocate those funds. And eventually, Taney gets rewarded by becoming the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And that will be really important when we get closer to the Civil War, because Taney was Chief Justice of the Court during the infamous Dred Scott decision. If you've never heard of it before, stay tuned, because we will talk about that really, really problematic Supreme Court decision. So anyway, these smaller pet banks, eventually, that's where the federal money went. And the problem with that was that those banks were less regulated than the Bank of the United States. And one thing that they did way too often was they printed more money. They rapidly increased the amount of money in circulation, and they were printing paper currency. And it's just paper. It wasn't backed up in anything. So this caused rapid inflation. And much of this currency was used to rapidly purchase land for speculation. So that just means purchasing land and trying to resell it for a profit. And this land speculation boom, or bubble rather, eventually burst. And so Jackson tried to fix that problem by issuing something called the Specie Circular. And what the Specie Circular was an attempt to only allow gold and silver currency to be used for land purchases. But at that point, already that speculation boom started to bust. So land sales were plummeting. Banks were not able to issue as much credit as they could before because of the Specie Circular. They could not loan out money in paper currency anymore. You also saw a lot of properties getting foreclosed. And some banks, when they tried to recall their loans to their creditors, to the lenders, that those lenders couldn't pay back that money. So some banks even were forced to close. And then regular civilians ended up losing their savings. And so the result of this was a major financial panic called the Panic of 1837, a wave of bank failures, rising unemployment, high interest, and little economic growth. And this economic panic, it's basically a recession, doesn't end until about the mid-1840s. So what's interesting about that is even though Jackson was responsible for quite a bit of this by killing the bank, shifting money into these local banks, he doesn't really get blamed for it. Maybe not at the time. Historians will look back and say Jackson sort of contributed to this problem, but we all know how things are. Normally, whoever the president is at the time is the one that gets blamed. So Martin Van Buren at that point was the new president. Jackson served his second term, and when he was on his way out of office, when it came time to select a new person to run as a Democrat, he thought that Martin Van Buren would be a good choice. That's why this cartoon, it shows Martin Van Buren piggyback riding on Andrew Jackson. So Martin Van Buren ended up largely getting blamed for this financial panic because he happened to be in the White House, and he got the nickname Martin Van Ruin. I don't know if that's sad or not, but it's very interesting to think about how another person ultimately gets blamed for this. And eventually we'll see that causes the Democratic Party to start to decline in popularity. And the Whig Party never actually only elects one president ever in history, William Henry Harrison. The Whig Party doesn't really catch on, but it will start to pave the way eventually for a Republican Party to emerge. But we'll talk about that in the next unit. So in conclusion, one big question we have to ask ourselves is, what was Andrew Jackson's legacy? How democratic was he? You know, more people had the right to vote when he ran for president the second time in 1828, but who were those people? And then how did he change the presidency? Jackson did not always adhere to the Constitution when making major decisions. So does this have lingering effects to today? how much has the executive branch expanded from when the Constitution was ratified until today? So, all these things and more we'll start to address in class. So, I hope this was really helpful for you guys, and we'll see each other soon. Thanks.